Carl Jung discovered something that shatters every spiritual guru's promise. True psychological integration doesn't begin when you think it does. After decades studying the human psyche, Jung found that most people mistake intellectual understanding for authentic transformation, spending years, sometimes decades, trapped in what he called the knowing that isn't knowing. You've read the books, you understand shadow work, you can explain the archetypes. But Jung would ask you one devastating question: are you integrated, or are you just well informed? Because there's a specific moment when real integration begins, and it's nothing like what you've been told. Here's what makes this discovery so unsettling. Jung realized that intellectual knowledge about the psyche can actually prevent genuine transformation. You become what he called spiritually bypassed, using psychological concepts as armor against the very experiences that would actually integrate you. The most shocking part? Jung found that this crucible can't be entered voluntarily. You can't think your way into integration. You can't plan for it. You can only be thrust into it by forces beyond your conscious control. These aren't complex psychological tests. They're recognizable patterns that reveal the deepest truths about transformation. And by the end of this exploration, you'll understand not just when integration begins, but why most people never cross that threshold. Because here's what Jung uncovered that modern psychology desperately avoids. Intellectual understanding creates the illusion of transformation while keeping you psychologically frozen. You think you're doing the work because you're thinking about the work. But Jung would say, you're actually building more sophisticated defenses. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But what does acceptance actually mean? Most people believe that understanding their psychology equals accepting it. Jung discovered the opposite. Intellectual understanding is often the final barrier preventing authentic acceptance. Let me reveal what Jung called the knowing paradox. The more you intellectualize your psychological patterns, the more distance you create between your conscious mind and your lived experience. You become an expert on yourself without actually changing yourself. Consider a composite example based on patterns Jung observed repeatedly. We see this dynamic in the profile of someone who spends years studying Jungian psychology, attending workshops, reading everything Jung wrote. They can articulate their shadow material with precision. They understand their projections. They've mapped their complexes. But Jung would see something they couldn't. They were using knowledge as protection. Every insight became another brick in the wall, separating them from direct experience. They weren't integrating. They were cataloging. They weren't transforming. They were narrating. This is what Jung termed psychic dissociation through intellectualization, the ability to know everything about your wounds without feeling them, to understand your patterns without changing them, to see your shadow without embodying its lessons. If you've ever caught yourself analyzing your pain instead of feeling it, comment, "I see the trap." Jung made a revolutionary discovery about when integration actually begins. It starts when your intellectual defenses collapse under the weight of undeniable experience. He called these moments initiatory events, experiences so powerful they shatter your ability to think your way through them. Here's what Jung found, studying hundreds of cases. True integration never begins during periods of stability. It doesn't start when you're ready. It doesn't emerge from conscious intention. Integration begins when life forces your hand through crisis, loss, or confrontation so intense that your psychological defenses break down completely. Jung identified 3 primary catalysts that initiate genuine integration: the dark night of necessity, when external circumstances destroy the life structure you've built; job loss, relationship endings, health crises, profound loss, events that strip away your ability to maintain your persona; the mirror of recognition, when someone or something reflects back aspects of yourself you've spent years denying. This could be a relationship that activates your deepest wounds, a child who embodies your rejected qualities, or a mentor who sees through your defenses. The eruption of the repressed, when psychological material you've been suppressing forces its way into consciousness through symptoms, panic attacks, depression, addiction, psychosomatic illness. Your psyche literally rebels against continued repression. Let's examine a narrative illustration of this process. A composite profile shows someone who builds their entire identity around being rational, controlled, successful. They've read Jung. They understand they have shadow material. They even know intellectually that their rigid control stems from earlier experiences. But this knowing changes nothing. They continue operating from the same patterns, just with better explanations for them. Then a major life crisis hits, perhaps a family member's sudden illness. Suddenly, they're confronted with chaos they cannot control, pain they cannot rationalize, and emotions they've spent decades suppressing. Jung would recognize this as an initiatory moment. The person's intellectual defenses are useless against uncontrollable suffering. Their need to control meets its match. Their repressed emotional life erupts through their concern. This is when integration actually begins, not through understanding, but through unavoidable confrontation with what they've been avoiding. But here's what Jung warned. Most people try to restore their old defenses as quickly as possible. They seek therapy to fix the crisis and return to normal. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. They're looking for new concepts to understand the experience. Jung called this aborting the initiation, refusing the descent that would actually transform you. After years of clinical observation, Jung made a precise distinction between intellectual understanding and embodied integration. He discovered specific markers that indicate when genuine transformation begins, and these markers are radically different from what most people expect. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But making the unconscious conscious isn't an intellectual exercise. It's a visceral, felt experience that reorganizes your entire being." The first marker of authentic integration is what Jung called affect breakthrough, when you feel emotions you've been intellectualizing for years. Not thinking about your anger, but experiencing it directly in your body. Not understanding your grief, but being overwhelmed by it. Not analyzing your shame, but allowing it to move through you completely. This is radically different from emotional catharsis or venting. Jung distinguished between emotional release and integration. Release is temporary. Integration is permanent. Release happens when you express emotion. Integration happens when you allow emotion to restructure your psyche. We see this dynamic clearly in a narrative illustration. Consider someone who spent years in therapy discussing their childhood experiences. They understood the dynamics perfectly. They could explain how early patterns created current issues. They had insights stacked upon insights. Then one day, something breaks open. Perhaps seeing a parent with their child in public triggers something visceral. They feel the full weight of their childhood longing, not as a concept, but as a lived experience in their chest. They're experiencing what they'd been thinking about for decades. Jung would recognize this as the beginning of integration. The person's intellectual understanding transformed into embodied knowing. Their psychological material moved from their head into their heart, from concept into experience, from knowing about to knowing through. The second marker Jung identified is shadow encounter. The moment when you recognize your denied qualities, not as ideas, but as living energies within you. You don't just understand that you have a shadow. You meet it as a present reality. Let's look at a case profile demonstrating this process. A composite example shows someone who prided themselves on being kind, compassionate, and spiritually evolved. They studied shadow work extensively. They could list their shadow qualities with clinical precision, but these remained concepts until they found themselves feeling genuine rage in a caregiving situation. Not frustration they could explain away, not irritation they could rationalize, raw fury that horrified them. The horror of this feeling was the doorway to integration, not because the feeling was wrong, but because it was real. Jung would say this person finally met their shadow as a living presence, rather than an intellectual category. This encounter, feeling what you've judged as unacceptable, is where integration actually begins. The third marker is what Jung termed the death of the hero, when you stop trying to perfect yourself and start accepting your wholeness. Consider someone who approached Jungian work with typical achievement mentality, reading all the books, attending all the workshops, determined to do shadow work right. They were trying to achieve integration, to master the psyche. Jung would see this as the ego's final defense, turning integration into another accomplishment. True integration begins when this achievement orientation collapses, when you realize you're not fixing yourself, you're becoming yourself. Jung made a crucial observation that shatters expectations. Integration is not linear, not predictable, and certainly not comfortable. He called it circumambulating the self, spiraling around your center, sometimes closer, sometimes further, never arriving, because arrival isn't the point. Here's what Jung discovered. Integration doesn't feel like progress most of the time. It feels like regression, confusion, contradiction, and chaos. You'll have profound insights followed by months of feeling lost. You'll integrate shadow material only to discover deeper layers. You'll achieve clarity about one complex while another erupts. Jung wrote, "The psyche is not a homogeneous unity, but rather a multitude of split-off fragments. Integration means bringing these fragments into relationship, not resolving them into neat answers. The early integration phase looks nothing like spiritual narratives promise. You're not ascending to higher consciousness, you're descending into your own depths. You're not becoming more enlightened, you're becoming more human. You're not transcending your darkness, you're learning to live with it consciously." Let me illustrate with a composite pattern Jung documented. A narrative example shows someone who begins genuine integration after crisis shatters their defenses. For the first few months, they experience breakthrough, emotions flowing, insights emerging, old patterns becoming visible. But then something unexpected happens. They start cycling through contradictory states. One day they feel integrated and whole. The next day, old patterns return with full force. They understand their shadow intellectually, but find themselves acting it out behaviorally. Jung would say this isn't failure, it's integration. The cycling, the contradiction, the falling back into old patterns while being conscious of them represents the psyche reorganizing itself at a fundamental level. You're not supposed to transcend your complexes. You're supposed to develop a conscious relationship with them. Jung identified what he called the recognition without power phase. When you can see your patterns clearly, but lack the psychological strength to change them consistently. This phase frustrates people intensely because they think seeing should equal changing. But Jung discovered that consciousness develops before capacity. You become aware of your shadow projections months or years before you can consistently withdraw them. You recognize your complexes long before you can prevent them from activating. This isn't failure, it's the natural progression of integration. Awareness is the first step, but embodiment takes time, usually years, not months. The key developmental shift Jung identified is moving from external validation to internal authority. In the early integration phase, you're constantly checking if you're doing it right, if you're making progress. We see this in a case profile of someone who begins integration work with tremendous enthusiasm. They're journaling, processing dreams, doing active imagination. They're working hard, but gradually, something subtle shifts. They care less about whether they're doing it correctly and more about what feels authentic. They stop measuring progress and start living experience. They develop what Jung called psychological trust, faith in their own process rather than adherence to external frameworks. Jung warned about what he termed integration inflation, mistaking early shifts for complete transformation. After the first breakthrough, people often believe they've arrived. But Jung discovered this is usually just the first layer. The psyche reveals itself in stages, showing you what you're ready to integrate while protecting you from what you're not. Jung spent decades studying how people actually integrate shadow material, and what he discovered contradicts almost every popular psychology teaching. The shadow doesn't get healed or transcended. It gets recognized, related to, and integrated into conscious awareness while remaining fundamentally powerful. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." But what does making darkness conscious actually look like? Not what most people imagine. True shadow integration means developing a conscious relationship with qualities you've judged as unacceptable rather than eliminating them. You don't stop being aggressive. You become conscious of your aggression and choose how to express it. You don't eliminate your selfishness. You acknowledge it and decide when it serves you. Let's examine a composite case Jung documented. A narrative illustration shows someone who discovers through integration work that they have significant aggressive energy they've been suppressing their entire life. This aggression was judged as dangerous. They've built their identity around being peaceful, kind, non-confrontational. But as they integrate, they recognize this suppressed aggression has been leaking out in passive-aggressive behavior, resentment, and psychosomatic symptoms. The work isn't to eliminate the aggression, it's to bring it into consciousness and learn to channel it constructively. At first, they swing to the opposite extreme, becoming overtly aggressive in ways that damage relationships. Jung would call this shadow possession, being overwhelmed by newly conscious material. But gradually, they learn to relate to their aggression as energy, as boundary-setting capacity, as healthy self-assertion. This is integration, not elimination. The aggressive energy remains, but it's no longer unconscious, no longer controlling behavior from the shadows. It becomes available as conscious choice. Jung identified what he called the pendulum of integration, the swinging between extremes that characterizes genuine psychological transformation. Before integration, you're rigidly identified with one pole. During integration, you swing wildly between poles. After integration, you can access both poles consciously. We see this pattern in a case profile of someone who's been identified as the responsible one their entire life. They're reliable, mature, always taking care of others. But their shadow contains irresponsibility, spontaneity, selfishness. As they integrate, they might swing into reckless behavior, making impulsive decisions, abandoning responsibilities, acting purely from desire. This isn't the goal, but Jung recognized it as often necessary. You have to overcorrect before you find balance. Eventually, they develop the capacity to be both responsible and spontaneous, both caretaking and self-focused, depending on what the situation requires. Jung made a critical distinction between positive shadow and negative shadow that most people miss. Negative shadow contains qualities you judge as bad, aggression, selfishness, cruelty. But positive shadow contains qualities you judge as too much, your power, your creativity, your sexuality, your ambition. For many people, especially those socialized to be small and accommodating, the positive shadow is harder to integrate. It's more frightening to claim your power than admit your cruelty. Consider a narrative example of positive shadow integration. A composite profile shows someone who recognizes they've been dimming their intelligence, downplaying their competence, and hiding their ambition because these qualities threatened others. Integration means claiming these positive qualities, not arrogantly, but authentically, allowing yourself to be powerful, intelligent, ambitious without apology. This often feels more transgressive than acknowledging negative traits because it requires taking up space you've been taught you don't deserve. Jung discovered that shadow integration fundamentally changes your relationships because you stop projecting and stop accepting projections. You recognize your own capacity for the qualities you used to see only in others. You stop splitting the world into good people and bad people. This makes relationships both more honest and more challenging. You can't use others as receptacles for your disowned material. You have to relate to actual humans in all their complexity, which requires relating to yourself in all your complexity first. Jung's most profound insight: integration isn't something you complete, it's something you practice for life. He called this individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, beneath conditioning, projection, and persona. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this isn't a destination you reach, it's an orientation you maintain. Every phase of life brings new integration challenges." Jung identified what he called the spiral of integration. You return to the same psychological material at different levels throughout your life. You work with your abandonment wound in your 20s, again in your 40s after major loss, again in your 60s as you face mortality. Each time, you're working with the same core pattern, but with greater depth and capacity. This isn't regression, it's spiraling. You're not back where you started. You're encountering familiar territory with fundamentally different consciousness. Consider a narrative spanning decades. A composite case shows someone doing profound integration work in their 30s around authority, healing wounds, integrating shadow around power, developing healthy assertion. 20 years later, facing retirement and loss of professional identity, the same material returns. They're working with authority again, but now from the other side, learning to release authority, to mentor others, to age gracefully. The core psychological territory is the same, but the developmental task has transformed. Jung would say this is exactly how individuation works. You don't resolve core patterns once and for all. You develop an increasingly sophisticated relationship with them across your entire lifespan. Jung made a crucial distinction between psychological healing and spiritual growth. Healing addresses wounds and developmental gaps. Growth involves developing capacities that were never there to begin with. Both are necessary. Neither is complete without the other. Many people approach integration purely as healing, trying to fix what's broken. But Jung discovered that at a certain point, healing becomes growth. You've processed wounds, integrated shadow, but the work continues because the self is inexhaustible. Let's examine a composite pattern. A case profile shows someone who completes extensive trauma work, processes childhood wounds, and achieves genuine healing. They feel fundamentally changed, no longer controlled by their past. But then they notice a restlessness, a sense that something more is calling. This isn't unresolved trauma, it's the self pulling them toward unmanifested potential. They're being invited to develop capacities, express creativity, embody wisdom that has nothing to do with healing and everything to do with becoming. Jung discovered that integrated individuals don't look enlightened in the traditional sense. They're not perpetually peaceful or above human concerns. They're fundamentally human, emotionally real, psychologically aware, capable of both joy and suffering. Integration makes you more authentic, not more perfect, more real, not more refined, more human, not more enlightened. Jung identified specific markers of deep integration. You experience fewer psychological surprises, not because you're in control, but because you recognize your patterns as they emerge. You can hold contradiction without needing to resolve it. You're both generous and selfish, kind and cruel, without needing one side to win. You take responsibility for your projections quickly. When you have an intense reaction, you instinctively ask what they're mirroring, rather than assuming the reaction is entirely about them. You relate to symptoms differently. Depression, anxiety, anger aren't problems to eliminate, but messages from your psyche. You can be alone without being lonely. You've developed an internal relationship with yourself that provides substance, regardless of external circumstances. After all the theory, Jung's most practical insight, integration shows up not in peak experiences, but in daily interactions. How you handle traffic, respond to criticism, navigate conflict reveals your actual level of integration more than your spiritual experiences or psychological insights. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." This acceptance manifests not in profound meditation, but in how you treat yourself when you make a mistake, how you respond when someone disappoints you. Integrated. Living means your psychological awareness translates into behavioral change, emotional flexibility, and relational capacity. You're not just conscious of your patterns, you're actually different because of that consciousness. Let's look at how this manifests. Consider a composite example navigating a common challenge. A narrative illustration shows someone whose partner forgets their birthday. The old pattern would be explosive anger or passive-aggressive withdrawal, both driven by an activated complex around being forgotten. But with integration, something different happens. They still feel hurt. Integration doesn't eliminate feelings, but they notice the feeling arising. They recognize the complex activating. They see the childhood wound being triggered, and with this awareness, they can choose their response. They might say, "I feel hurt that you forgot my birthday." This touches an old wound about being overlooked. This is radically different from "you always forget about me" or silently withdrawing. Integration creates space between stimulus and response. Jung discovered that integrated individuals develop what he called psychological discrimination, the capacity to distinguish between past wounds being triggered and present reality. They can feel old pain without collapsing past and present. This discrimination doesn't mean feelings become less intense. You might feel profound abandonment when plans get cancelled, but you can simultaneously recognize that the intensity comes from earlier experiences rather than the current situation. This recognition doesn't make the feeling go away, but it prevents destructive decisions based on it. We see this in a case profile of someone who's done extensive work on rejection sensitivity. When they're excluded from a social event, they still feel the sting, but they don't spiral into shame, don't create narratives about being fundamentally unlovable, don't make impulsive decisions to protect themselves. Instead, they feel the feeling, recognize where it comes from, and respond proportionately to the actual situation. This is integration in action, not eliminating emotional reactivity, but bringing consciousness to it. Jung made a critical observation about how integration changes your relationship to conflict. Before integration, conflict feels threatening to your psychological survival. Your ego is so identified with being right, being good, being acceptable, that challenge feels existential. After integration, you can engage conflict without defending your entire psychological structure. Someone can criticize you without you needing to prove they're wrong. Someone can reject you without you needing to demonstrate you're still valuable. Consider a narrative showing this shift. A composite profile demonstrates someone who receives critical feedback at work. Before integration, they became defensive, explaining why criticism was unfair, providing evidence of competence. After integration, the same. Person receives critical feedback and can pause. They might feel defensive initially. Integration doesn't eliminate ego reactions, but they can notice the defensiveness, ask if there's truth in the feedback, and respond from curiosity rather than protection. This doesn't mean accepting all criticism as valid. It means you can evaluate feedback without your entire sense of self collapsing. Jung discovered that integrated living manifests most clearly in your relationship with your body. How you treat physical symptoms, respond to aging, navigate illness reveals whether your integration is merely intellectual or genuinely embodied. True integration includes the body, listening to its wisdom, respecting its limits, trusting its signals. You recognize that depression might be your body saying you need rest. Anxiety might indicate you're out of alignment, and physical symptoms might be psychological material expressing through the body. So when does integration truly begin? Jung's answer: it begins when intellectual knowing collapses into embodied experience, when crisis shatters your defenses, when life forces you to feel what you've been thinking about, when your psychological material becomes so intense you can no longer theorize it away. But Jung discovered something more important than when integration begins. It never ends. Every phase of life brings new depths to explore. Every transition requires new integration. Every challenge reveals previously unconscious material waiting to be brought into awareness. The illusion isn't that you haven't started integrating. It's that integration will ever be complete. You're not working toward a finished state of psychological perfection. You're participating in an endless process of becoming more conscious, more authentic, more whole. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." This awakening isn't a single moment. It's a continuous practice of looking inside, feeling what's there, integrating what you find, and discovering there's always more depth to explore. Integration doesn't begin when you understand it intellectually. It begins when you stop understanding and start feeling. When you stop planning your transformation and start living into it. When you recognize that the psychological discomfort you've been trying to resolve is actually the doorway you've been seeking. Jung discovered that integrated individuals aren't the ones who figured everything out. They're the ones who stopped trying to figure it out and started experiencing it directly. They moved from knowing about themselves to knowing themselves. They transformed psychology from information into embodied wisdom. The question isn't whether you'll integrate. Life will ensure that you do. The question is whether you'll integrate consciously or unconsciously, whether you'll resist the process or cooperate with it. Jung's final message: you can't think your way into integration, but your thinking prepares you for the moment when thinking fails and feeling begins. Write in the comments, integration is not a destination. Let's build a community of people who understand that becoming whole is a lifelong practice. Subscribe because we're just beginning to explore the depths of Jungian psychology. Thank you for walking this path with me. See you in the next exploration. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.